Thank you. And I'm going to get the AV guy to start my presentation to avoid any issues. But yeah, as Mel mentioned, I will be presenting some of the key findings from this year's IDRS and EDRS this year. Yep. And before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge that this is a national collaborative program of work that involves many different people and many different organisations, so big thank you to everyone involved. And of course, would like to acknowledge our funders from the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care, and also a big thank you to the thousands of participants who have shared their knowledge and expertise with us over the past couple of decades. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Drug Trends, this is a national program of work that's been running for over 2 decades, and its primary purpose is to monitor trends in drug use, drug markets, and drug-related behaviours. And we do this through a number of different ways. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but one of the primary components involves conducting annual surveys with people who regularly use illegal drugs. So as part of the Ecstasy and Related Drugs Reporting System, or the EDRS, we conduct annual surveys with people who use ecstasy and other stimulants. And as part of the Illicit Drug Reporting System, we conduct annual surveys with people who inject drugs. So these are 2 very distinct samples. So our IDRS sample is typically an older kind of demographic in their mid-40s, more disadvantaged, whereas the EDS group is typically a bit younger, and more well-educated and more diversity in type of drugs they're using. So we've been running these surveys for about 2 decades, and they're not representative samples, but rather they're designed to detect emerging trends in drug use, and we recruit people from every capital city across Australia. So they're urban samples and can't be generalised to regional or rural areas. So with all that in mind, what were the key findings to emerge from this year? So really one of the key findings continues to be around the resilience of drug use and drug markets. So I know we're all very sick of hearing about COVID, but Liv published this paper earlier this year, which looked at the impact of COVID-19 on drug markets using data from the EDRS and IDRS. And what we found is that there were quite immediate impacts on our heroin and methamphetamine markets, but they were quite short-lived, so we did start to see recovery in the following year. And I've just included crystal methamphetamine here as an illustration of that. So as we can see, in 2020, there was that quite dramatic drop in perceived availability, so people reporting that it was harder to get, but that was largely recovered by 2021. And that kind of recovery has been sustained this year in 2023. So most people continuing to report that methamphetamine's easy to obtain, and the market has kind of stabilised in that way. And the IDRS sample continues, about 81% continue to report using crystal methamphetamine, so very common among this group of people. In terms of the ecstasy and cocaine markets, we did see a more delayed impact on drug markets. And these impacts were most evident in 2022, so last year. So we were kind of interested to see if we were going to see recovery in these drug markets this year. And essentially we have seen some evidence of that. So we asked about 4 different types of ecstasy in our survey. So I'm going to focus just on one today, so ecstasy caps, because that is the most commonly used form. And as we can see, the availability of ecstasy capsules became more difficult in 2022, as I said, so the impact was most evident in 2022, but we have started to see a bit of a recovery this year, so more people, and this held true across all forms of ecstasy, so the availability had increased again. In terms of price, we are seeing a bit more of a mixed picture, so price does remain elevated, so it hasn't quite returned to what we were seeing pre-COVID in terms of the median price that people were paying per cap. And we can see that perceived purity has also started to trend up again. Having said that, in terms of this is a group of people who use ecstasy, so obviously use is high, but the frequency with which people are using these drugs hasn't quite returned to the levels that we were seeing pre-COVID. And if we look at the national wastewater data, we can see a similar trend in that data as well. So we can see that MDMA consumption was trending downwards until about 2022, but from the middle of 2022, it started to trend upwards again, but it still hasn't returned to what we were seeing pre-COVID. So certainly something to watch. In terms of cocaine, we're seeing a bit more of a mixed picture. So we can see that cocaine availability just kind of continued to increase according to participant reports throughout the pandemic. So it's just becoming easier to obtain. And pretty much all participants reporting that it's pretty easy to obtain in 2023. Despite that, price has remained elevated. So people are paying $350 for a gram, which is pretty expensive. But it doesn't seem to be deterring people from using. So we're still seeing high numbers of people using cocaine. So about 81% of our EDR sample had used cocaine in the past 6 months, although frequency still remains low. And this, resilience of drug markets is demonstrated obviously in the global markets as well. So this is from the World Drug Report of this year. And as we can see from this graph here, we're experiencing kind of a prolonged surge in both the supply and production of cocaine globally. And in terms of methamphetamine, use has kind of plateaued in traditional markets, but it continues to kind of expand and grow in non-traditional markets, which includes the Middle East and Southwest Asia. And as Paul mentioned previously, there has been a ban on opium production. So it was predicted that there was going to be a disruption to the heroin market in 2023. We haven't seen evidence of that yet in our samples, but as Paul mentioned, certainly something to watch. On a different note, one of the other key findings to emerge from our surveys is around e-cigarettes. So it's now been 2 years since legislation was introduced, which meant that all nicotine vaping products require a prescription to obtain them. But as we can see, this has had no real impact on use among our samples. So about 2/3 of the sample continue to report using e-cigarettes, and about 1/3 of our sample of people who inject drugs report using e-cigarettes. And the frequency with which people are using these drugs has increased. So our sample of people who use ecstasy and other stimulants are using them about 3 days a week. And our sample of people who inject drugs are using them about every second day. And this frequency of use has increased considerably from previous years. And very few people reporting that they're actually getting prescribed e-cigarettes. Oh, not too early. And when we asked people where they had obtained their non-prescribed e-cigarettes from, so most of them were continuing to get them under the counter or from friends and dealers, and about 1 in 10 were getting them online. So one of the key questions is, well, are people who are using e-cigarettes just using the vaping juice or the flavouring? But no, most people are continuing to use e-cigarettes that contain nicotine, and about 1 in 3 are reporting them using them as a smoking cessation tool. So most people are using them for recreational purposes. And pretty much no one in our sample reported any trouble accessing e-cigarettes in the past 6 months. So as far as we can see, there is no major impact on the legislation on e-cigarette use among these groups. However, it does continue to remain a government priority. So earlier this year, the federal government announced that they would be taking further action to reduce both smoking and vaping. So yeah, it definitely does remain a government priority in a space that we'll be continuing to watch. And if you are interested in the dual use of e-cigarettes and tobacco, we do have a poster down the end here, which was done by Carly, so I encourage you to go along and check that out. And finally, I just wanted to end so as part of the Drug Trends Program of work, we do collect information on a range of different behaviours, one of which are around naloxone uptake. So, and just flagging that we have been continuing to see an upward trend in naloxone awareness and uptake among our sample of people who inject drugs. And yeah, an increase in the proportion who are continuing to, who had access naloxone in the past year. And we can't for sure say that this is a reflection of so it was about a year ago that the national take-home naloxone pilot was rolled out. And so it's a good news story that we are continuing to see uptake increase. As Paul mentioned, synthetic opioids are an emerging concern both in Australia and globally. So the nitazines in particular are something that has been emerging as a concern. And there was a really interesting presentation a few weeks ago, which was hosted by NCRED, where they were looking at about 11 patients who were presented with nitazine poisonings. And what they found is that most of these were unintentional and people were consuming what they thought was cocaine, ketamine, vaping products and whatnot. So although these are groups of people who typically wouldn't know about naloxone or access naloxone, I think this kind of emerging synthetic opioid market does suggest that we might need to consider other groups of people who might need to access naloxone. And I have really whipped through that. Our national reports are now available online. There's a lot of data in here, so I encourage you to go along and check those out. There's a few posters at the back as well, which will look at certain topics in more detail. Our jurisdictional reports will become available on the 7th of December as well, for those of you who may be interested in what's happening in your own jurisdiction. And for further information, please subscribe to our newsletter or head along to our website. Thank you very much.